Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Astrology, Reincarnation, and Soul webinar on real money and lasting love. On your little screen, you can see Mark Jones, who's going to be our first speaker today. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Kim.
Hello, welcome.
Thank you.
You bet. I'll give you a more formal introduction in just a moment here. Hello, everyone. We are back up and running and talk about this Cardinal Grand Cross. We are living it, meaning Leroy and Star Lady. And we're moving through it. Leroy had some really good quotes for me the other day. He said, diamonds are made under pressure. So we're turning ourselves into diamonds this week. Little joke there. But you will see on the top of your screen here our beginning screens for EAN. You see our contact information. You see the list of all the speakers. We're about halfway through the list as of today. And so there's the way to get a hold of us if you need to. And hold on a second, I've got to click on my screen to get my little mouse to work. So here is what we offer on our website at EAN, from our free weekly podcast to our Astro Library to our multimedia course, including its certification. And our EAN Astro Library, as many of you who have been tuning into these lectures every single day, we appreciate you very much. Here are the three sections we offer under the Astro Library. One of the little tidbits for you is when I did do the Outer Planet Workshop series on Neptune, that Neptune series was a lot of your beginning basics of the 12 archetypes on evolutionary astrology. And it also included a lot of information on health and wellness of each of the 12 archetypes. So the Neptune Outer Series workshop not only ended up in section 1, it also ended up in section 3 if any of you are interested in more EA information on health and wellness. And then, of course, here's our multimedia course that we offer in our 3 different segments. Many of you may be familiar that I've reached 10 years of doing a monthly audio class on segment 1, 250 hours of archived audio files. Those are available to anybody from any segment purchase. And starting the beginning of next year, I'm going to move into teaching a monthly webinar class on segment 2. And so if you're wanting to get started with any segment 2 materials, we are shipping them day by day as people order, and you can get started on the DVDs and study and get ready, because the beginning of next year our monthly classes will start out working our way through the homework assignments for segment 2 step by step. All right, thank you very much. At this point, Leroy, you can turn the screen back over to Mark. And I'd like to introduce Mark to everybody. He is coming to us from Bristol, England. I will ask Mark to give a little bit of information in regards to his background and how he found evolutionary astrology and how he works with it today. Before I do, I would just like to say that I first met Mark back in 2001 in Port Townsend, Washington, at the very first Jeffrey Wolf Green Evolutionary Astrology Conference. And Mark, it has just been such a pleasure for Leroy and I to know you over the last 10, 12 years. We appreciate your friendship, we appreciate your camaraderie, and we appreciate what a gifted evolutionary astrologer you are. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm a psychotherapist as well as an astrologer, and really that's been the leading edge of my evolution in the last 10 or 12 years. So prior to that, I was studying psychosynthesis therapy, which is a form of spiritual psychotherapy, and I was studying evolutionary astrology, and I was studying Noel Till's master's program, Synthesis and Counseling in Astrology. So I really was doing a lot of studies at the same time, and I literally finished all of those in 2002 and taught my first school of evolutionary astrology in the UK in 2003. And really, since that point, I've been teaching regularly, and I've had a lot of experience teaching students and the common ways that students struggle, just as I myself struggled, to integrate the sheer complexity and level of meaning in astrology. But also, I've been watching more recently the potential for the healing interface between therapy, a spiritually orientated therapy, and evolutionary astrology and its vision of the soul's evolutionary journey. And I think really that's the depth that we're going to be trying to access today. Because I want to approach this topic from a number of different levels, really. Um, one of which is to provide a background to the nature of the archetypes we're discussing when we approach the Pluto-Uranus square on an individual and a collective level. You can't even understand the nature of this square without delving deeper into the archetypes. Now, I'll just say at the start screen, plutoschool.com, www.plutoschool.com has lots of resources for students. Free resources, essays, access to audio and video downloads, and paid for talks and books and materials, as well as an online tuition program if anyone's interested in my work. Now, let's start to, let me just check that I can actually, there we are. So when we face, if it's all right with everyone, I'll just say to begin with, having introduced myself, what I'll do for the sake of the recording is turn off the webcam and then put it back on when I take some questions and answers later on. So for the moment, goodbye everyone, God bless, but I will just continue as a voice and lead you through my presentation, and at the end then I'll come back on the webcam and take questions. Thanks. So, how do we look at astrology? Full stop. Richard Tarnas, perhaps the leading figure in the attempt to make astrology an academically valid subject, gave a keynote talk at NORWAC a couple of years ago, in which he quite intriguingly described astrology as the gold standard of superstition in our age. It is literally the litmus test of that which is naive, trashy, full of BS. I remember myself reading a science book that I was really interested in, that I was engaged in, and then it gave an example of like an outmoded theory. And it likened it metaphorically, it was as much nonsense as, say, believing in astrology. And this is the example of what Richard is talking about. Astrology is seen as the gold standard, the measuring device for all that is nonsense in our culture. Now, this leaves us in a very unusual position, as I would imagine everyone listening to this talk, live or on recording, disagrees with this position. And yet we face a world in which we are seen at best as entertainers, or kind of fringe, hippie, mystic figures. Now, why is this important? Well, I think in a culture that has primarily abandoned divinity and the sacred nature of life, we are looking at the gold standard of superstition as containing amongst its so-called trash heap genuine nuggets of gold. Because we live in an age where a vision of meaning in the largest possible sense has been surrendered to the progress of technology, to the scientific vision, if you like. So here we are, like in our own way, intellectually speaking, some, children of some shanty town. We are intellectually rummaging around this trash heap of history, of culture, and here is this hidden gold. The profound personal and collective vision of meaning that astrology can offer. Now, I think when we engage with the Pluto-Uranus square, as indeed with any significant aspect of astrology, we are essentially positing that the sky outside, the sky when you were born, the nature of the sky right now as we speak, has an impact within you. This is the correspondence that astrology makes. There is no easy explanation for this, for sure. I mean, some very intelligent and articulate books. One that springs to mind by Geoffrey Cornelius, called The Moment of Astrology, attempt to explore what this might involve. Right from the dawn of civilization, if you like, people have used auguries or divination. Augury itself was literally based on the pattern of flight of birds through a particular window. So you would just choose the window, and then based on how the birds flew across or up or down in that window, you would have a divinatory meaning present itself. Now, the birth chart and the chart of the sky at any given moment presents this weird symbolic correspondence to a world of meaning. So the Pluto-Uranus square existing outside in the sky right now has an impact on the sky within. This is the real nature of what I wish to address in this talk. So we will look at some external factors. Many people, I'm sure, have pointed out the way that this aspect corresponds to social upheaval, the Arab Spring, the fight for liberty or justice within certain countries. I wish to centralize the meaning on an internal level. What is this upheaval, this revolution within? What is the meaning inside of us? Now, I would argue towards a vision that I call the astrology of liberation. A vision in which astrology is a harmonious metaphysical system in order to help us liberate. And in fact, any other use of astrology, however intellectually interesting, is ultimately a distraction. Astrology either helps us live our lives more passionately, more deeply, more freely, or it does not. Or it is simply like a crossword or Sudoku, a puzzle. I look at charts for a puzzle. I like to see the correspondence between astrology and certain movements in history. I do too. But why? Why are we looking at astrology like that? What does it tell us if we can correspond certain planetary signatures to certain movements in history? And what does it tell us about ourselves as human beings? Now, I think fundamentally the symbolism of Uranus and Pluto are about depth and the capacity for depth in the human realm, in the realm of our being. I want us to consider today a radical perspective on astrology itself. The Uranus-Pluto square in the sky involves this social, political, economic upheaval, revolution, crisis. Something is going on collectively, sure. But how might we contextualize this internally? How might we understand the revolution within? And the revolution within that astrology itself promotes. Now, our linear mind, our understanding of ourselves as a personality, comes in a sense through the Saturn cycle. Saturn is the boundary of the experience of the personal consciousness. So here we have a quote from Sigmund Freud detailing the way that coherent memory, a linear-like sequence, occurs in the developing self around age 6 or 7, corresponding with the Saturn square, which itself corresponds to the cardinal cross in the cycle. If we take birth at Aries, we are born. Here, all experience is purely instinctual. All experience floods the being of the self on an instinctual level. We learn through touching, through grasping, through crying. Everything is immediate, everything is visceral. This develops through Taurus, the development of a consistent sense of self, what psychologists call self and object constancy. This is where the child learns to internalize his or herself in a consistent fashion and the reality of the mother in a consistent fashion. So in the Taurus phase of development, the child can play separate from the mother, but retain the mother's image as an increasingly coherent presence. So it's another step from the instinctual body of Aries towards this development of a coherent sense of memory or time that Freud is referring to in the previous quotation. So here we're looking at astrology as a developmental model of the psyche. It's not the only way to look at astrology, but it's clear that it can be used in this way. Now, in this context, Aries as pure instinct shifts to Taurus, in which value is internalized within the self. This value within the self and the holding environment in which it occurs then becomes the basis for the learning of language, skills, and early mentation in Gemini. And studies have clearly shown without a stable holding environment, without the touch and safety and warmth of the parents, the child does not learn language skills. The child does not develop those capacities. Feral children, for example, brought up by wolves or dogs, never really learn very many words. They will tend to actually bark as a response. Language is not just something that can be learned at any point. It arises from an environment of care and holding and safety of this self and object constancy. So we see that as Taurus arises from the instinctual self of Aries going within and finding value, Gemini arises from that value in Taurus as the capacity to interact with our early environment through words, through mimicry. Now, the combination of this early physical instinctual body in Aries, this emotional value within in Taurus, and this mental capacity at Gemini coalesce in the archetype of Cancer, the moon, in the formation of a personal ego or a conditioned self. Now this occurs at the first Saturn return. Freud was no astrologer, but this is what he's referring to when he says, not before our 6th or our 7th year are our lives reproduced by the memory as a coherent chain of events. So the moon, Cancer, and the 4th house, this blends Aries, Taurus, Gemini into this coherence, this sequence of events or memories. And this occurs coincident with the first Saturn square. Now, why is this relevant to us? Because this is the whole way our conditioned self arises from the totality of the potential of our being in the current life. This is the filter. This occurred before you're old enough to truly recognize that it occurred. Or, more accurately, as you become old enough at 6 or 7 to realize that this is occurring, it has already occurred to you. So if we are goldfish in a bowl, this is the bowl. A separate sense of self, an ego arising out of the totality of our soul's being in the conditions of the current life, shaped through birth, Aries, the development of internal value, Taurus, languaging skills, Gemini, into Moon, a sense of the conditioned self or ego. Now, when we are looking at the archetype of Uranus, and this is what we need to consider today, we need to consider the nature of Uranus, the nature of Pluto, and then the nature of the signs they occupy, Uranus in Aries, Pluto in Capricorn, and then the nature of that aspect, a square, actually a first quarter square, which we'll go on to explore. But we need to lay this groundwork conceptually to understand these archetypes at the level of depth I would encourage us to explore them on. Now, we can contrast the archetype of Uranus with the archetype of Mercury in a certain vision of astrology that I wrote about in a book called Transpersonal Astrology recently. The outer planets are seen as higher octaves of the personal planets. Uranus, specifically, is seen as the higher octave of Mercury. What does this mean? Mercury is the function of our mind that through Gemini in the third house amasses data, amasses information, is listening to this talk right now. Maybe making some notes, maybe thinking, where are we going? Where does this all lead? Now, Mercury in Virgo becomes an act of discrimination about this. Some of what Mark's saying makes sense to me. Some of it doesn't. I may use some of what Mark is saying, I may not. Virgo is the process of discrimination where this data will be ordered in some kind of way. Now, Uranus refers to a completely different level of the mind, what I call the non-linear mind. The non-linear mind is held within the non-linear energy field that is akin to your true self. And the non-linear mind holds information and memories that you may not be conscious of. These can correspond to certain early childhood experiences, experiences in the womb, during the birth process, experiences in between lives, and prior lives, whatever they actually are. It's not our purpose today to explore what prior lives are. We can observe, though, experientially, people experience them. I myself had a client spontaneously regress into a past life during a relaxation exercise. So I have direct experience that it is an experiential reality. Now, whether it is as simple as we just reincarnate life after life after life in a linear sequence like that, when time is probably much more complex, these are great mysteries. It occurs to me in certain deep states of spiritual awareness, people talk about time not existing anymore, in which case all seemingly past and indeed all seemingly future lives would be co-present with the current life. So all of this may be existing at the same time. This is a Uranian kind of insight. This is what I mean by non-linear. The Mercury mind processes things in a sequence. A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The Uranian mind perceives things as totalities, holographically. It can involve direct knowing with no series of sequential steps to lead to that direct knowing. So we are talking about some subtle aspect of the mind that literally floods the individual mind with light, with meaning. Now, we can then begin to contextualize the Saturn function as actually a protective function. That actually, if we were open to everything that we could possibly perceive right now, we would be so flooded with meaning and with things jostling within us for our attention that we would not be able to function in a day-to-day way. If I, for example, suddenly perceived every possible way the Pluto-Uranus square could operate, even just that alone right now, in every possible historical epoch, in every way in my personal life, the life of my clients, that would be so flooding with information that I wouldn't be able to function to give the talk. Never mind if I suddenly became aware of every single past life I've ever experienced, or some absolutely profound, life-changing personal insight occurred to me at this point. I may not be able to continue with my appointed task. The function of the brain and nervous system, the function of the Saturn boundary of the structure of consciousness of the personal self, is to make sure that we filter out that which does not prove useful or conducive to our survival or effective functioning in the present. So the irony here is the brain, if you like, is not this supercomputer sense organ. It is actually a valve system on some level trying to reduce the amount of information that might flood to us from our nonlinear awareness. So we are actually beings consciously and unconsciously filtering out wisdom and information from our soul on a daily basis, on a moment-to-moment basis, in order to function. Saturn is the ultimate symbol of the boundary between the personal planets, the Sun and Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and the types of consciousness symbolized by the outer planets. And we could call this the boundary between the personal and the transpersonal self. This is key when understanding the Saturn function, that we limit ourselves from the amount of information we're taking on just to function in the world. So, how can we visualize what we are, in a sense, protecting ourselves from? Well, the evolutionary biologist Rupert Sheldrake has a whole series of books and a huge section of his work on this idea of morphogenetic fields, kind of non-linear energetic systems that remain as a blueprint behind the growth of plants, animals, and humans. These morphogenetic fields can hold information that leap across generations and even huge areas of space and time. So, for example, a species of, say, mouse in Australia learns a particular evolutionary adaptive method for gaining food from a certain seed that had protected itself in a certain way. It's not just that the next generation of those mice in Australia know how to do that, but generations of mice born in Europe or North America also know how to do it, as if the information has been transferred in a non-local form. Now, this transference of non-local energy is what we're concerned about when we explore this subtle field that envelops us. Look at this man in this picture. He is surrounded by an energetic field. We all are. Now, what's going on in that field? and how do certain archetypal configurations in the sky within trigger that field. So, a little bit like this sense of what happened with these, say, mice in Australia, Uranus and the Uranian mind corresponds to this non-local aspect of the mind in which a great idea can emerge into consciousness, or the consciousness of humanity, at the same time, perhaps through several figures. When Darwin is working on the theory of evolution, he discovers a man called Wallace also is, and has found almost exactly the same results. When Wallace sends Darwin, completely unaware what Darwin is working on, a copy of his papers, as Darwin's a respected scientist and he wants his advice, and Darwin, unwittingly and rather shockingly and rather personally concerningly, as he's quite attached to getting the theory of evolution out himself and it being associated with his name, but he discovers that Wallace has also uncovered this central truth almost at identically the same time as him. Now, what we want to add to this already kind of revolutionary insight, an insight so revolutionary that Rupert Sheldrake, for example, is villainized, partly because he's a Christian, and partly because it's perceived to be pseudo-spiritual nonsense, his idea of these morphogenetic fields by certain hardcore scientists. Well, I think you'll agree that from our point of view, in the trash heap of history, as the gold standard of superstition for a culture, we can perhaps perceive Sheldrake's work in a different way. And we can take it a step further. Now, the quote here is from Stanislav Grof, and this is from his book When the Impossible Happens, a book late on in his career, when he is not so attached to his academic funding and being perceived as some kind of figure of academic repute, if you like. Here he sort of fesses up. He owns that his insights involve a karmic dimension. This vision he has of these arcane symbols being blasted by a bolt of Uranian lightning onto this Saturnian stone in his vision, he senses that they are sacred. They revealed to him that he had a long series of lives preceding this one, and that according to the law of karma, he was responsible for his actions in those lives, although he could not remember them. Wow. That's a truly life-changing moment. Think about it. The clarity that emerges when with courage and integrity you accept that you are responsible for all the lives you've ever experienced, and every thought, action, deed, memory, fantasy that occurred in them. That the universe itself is a living field. If you like, that's almost like the Neptune kind of symbolism. The Uranus symbolism is the mind's subtle energy field. The Neptune symbolism is that everything is an energy field. And in a sense, the universe remembers. The universe knows who you are. Every hair on your head shall be counted, as the Bible says. That's like the esoteric meaning of that statement. You are known. Everything is known. Every squalid fantasy, every heroic deed, and every cowardly deed and thought. We are like Mart, the Egyptian goddess, weighed in the scales of justice, if you like. This is his realization of that. This is what he essentially hid in all these books, The Future of Psychology, The Holotropic Mind, brilliant visionary books that were already perceived to be so alternative, so non-linear, that most people couldn't cope with them. Later in his life, he feels able to share where it's really coming from. It's coming from soul. Soul as it embodies uh, an expression of itself through space and time, life after life. Now, this relationship between soul and the personal self or ego that acts as an expression of soul in each given life, I have termed the Pluto complex. This is from the first section of my book, Healing the Soul. The Pluto complex represents that fundamental issue between the intention and will of the deep self or soul, the emotional and psychological magnetism of the deep self or soul, and the separate personal concerns of the conditioned self or ego, and how easy it is for there to be an apparent conflict between those two forms. So here we have the problem of attraction and repulsion. We are attracted to things, other people, certain teachings, because of our soul's impulse leading us deeper into life. And then to the extent that we fear the annihilation of our personal self, or the overwhelm of our personal self, we want to run away from or push away from that which challenges us on that core level. This itself can become the basis for certain very profound existential states in which people know that they want to live a more fulfilling life. They feel a call of something deeper. They feel they want to make the leap, as it were, across the abyss into their full life, and yet they feel they can't. They're aware of themselves clinging to the last piece of shrubbery on the edge of the cliff to not make the leap. And here we encounter the basis of many, many states of primary existential anxiety that people go through because they are drawn to something, a more truer self-expression, a deeper way of living, a more fulfilling and authentic way of relating to others. Let's take an example. They just want to be honest with someone they care about. They just want to say, I really care about you, but when you behave in this way, it nearly kills me. Or when you talk to me like that, it nearly kills me. And they're too frightened to do so, and the behavior just cycles and spins and continues. It works on very simple levels all the way to huge global levels in which whole groups of people aspire to a more authentic way of life, in which they find the tyrannies and controls of the authorities around them too restrictive. Now, within the soul, the primary mode of experience is a qualitative one. It's based on intensity and meaning, not necessarily duration. So relatively ordinary, mundane things could go on for a very long time, and they wouldn't necessarily impact one as much as one very significant thing. And this applies not just in this life, but also as it pertains to memories from other lives and other times. Within this, then, we can say that the inner reality precedes the outer reality. Everything in your life manifests from the basis of who you really are inside, and the particular frequency and nature of your magnetism, of the electromagnetic field of your deep self. Reality and all its infinite variations can be likened to an infinite sea of tiny droplets of iron filings, if you like, responding to your electromagnetism and creating the patterns that take the forms that eventually lead to the circumstances of your life. And this operates both individually and collectively. Pluto then represents the core nature, psychologically, of the magnetism of this deep self. How reality around you is ordered based on your deep psychological focus and orientation, what you are identified with, what you are attracted to on a very deep level. Whereas, as we were talking about earlier, we remember that Uranus corresponds to a nonlinear aspect of the mind that remembers everything that has occurred. So Uranus holds mental imprints of everything that has occurred to you. Pluto represents a psychological, emotional magnetism of the deep self. Uranus represents the memory of the deep self, all the events that have been held within that mind, events that transcend the conditioning of the current life, which occurs around age 6 or 7 with the first Saturn square, as observed originally by Freud. So, what we can see here is operating together, Uranus holds the events of all these different lives, of the birth process, of the womb, of our early childhood, of our current life, of all these different experiences in other lives, and it holds them like a roll of film or like a series of images held in a sort of multi-dimensional library. And then based on Pluto, based on our emotional and psychological core attachments, we create meanings, we create stories from these events, from these memories. The memories are held in Uranus like a non-linear data collection, like a holographic library. And then from that, the core heart, if you like, of the soul, Pluto, the emotional psychological identifications of the deep self, chooses to expand certain images, certain memories into huge significance that become, if you like, the working metaphors of our deepest motivations, of our deepest life impulses. So we can liken, metaphorically, Uranus to the mind of the soul and Pluto to the heart of the soul. The mind of the soul sees and remembers everything. The heart of the soul is attracted to certain things more than others, and what it's going to do with them, and how it's going to love them, and through that love, how it's going to make meaning from their events, from their structures, from their stories. In a sense, this is how Pluto and Uranus operate together in the transpersonal layer of the psyche, the level beyond Saturn, beyond the identification with the personal self or I. Now, to return to that personal sense or I, Saturn, which is going to be important here for a number of reasons. A, it's the way that these non-linear states of Uranus and Pluto ground in the personal self. But also B, quite pertinently, as we go on to the Uranus-Pluto square, Pluto is in Capricorn, ruled by Saturn. Now, Saturn symbolizes the principle of structure itself. That could be structure of our consciousness, the structure of our family, our social group, our tribe, our society, country, even of a civilization itself. It also refers to the capacity to create boundaries. Saturn boundaries our personal experience. And therefore it selects which of these non-linear identifications, either in the mind of the soul, Uranus, or the heart of the soul, Pluto, we choose to actually act on or allow to emerge into our consciousness. Now, this natural eliminative function of the self, Saturn, this natural proclivity to create boundaries, can become tyrannical. This is the point that Freud noticed. Later on in his work, you can hear, as it were, saturated in his words, the disappointment he feels when psychoanalysis isn't really working for a lot of people. He even generates what he calls thanatos, the death instinct, to explore why. Why is this failing? Why isn't this working? As he experiences time and time again this inner defensiveness in people, this part of their psyche that's eliminative, if you like, that's trying to reduce all the potential overwhelming experiences that could happen to them, especially threatening experiences, especially if their parents have been punishing or their teachers punishing, or if they experience society itself as punishing. Or we can observe from a karmic point of view if they are carrying memories of guilt or punishment or shame, or being scapegoated, or being used and abused by tyrannical power, by political or social regimes that overwhelm them. Capricorn, Saturn, the authority from outside imposed. Now, this is an issue of universal importance in a way. There's just some background noise I'm experiencing. I don't know. Thanks. Um, this is an issue of universal importance for a number of reasons. One, on a very practical level, lots of people live haunted by this private fear that they will be discovered as shameful, they will be ousted, that they are somehow wrong, that they are deserving of punishment. The guilt and the reaction to these internal and external figures of authority becomes this primary battleground in life for authentic living, free from judgment, free from shame. This will apply in astrology readings. If there are students of astrology or practicing astrologers listening to this talk, I'm sure you know that even when you approach the chart with someone, some people are afraid of their chart and how it will somehow say bad things about them, or more accurately, I guess, confirm somehow the bad feelings they already have about themselves. To the extent that people can become literally afraid of showing you their chart, or both excited but afraid of what you're going to see there that might confirm that shame. So we must observe, even outside of Syria, even outside of Afghanistan or Iraq, or areas of conflict the world over, people live internally controlled, internally haunted by tyrannical voices, by the internalized figures of parents and teachers, but also by the karmic impressions left by the misuse of judgment, authority, and power upon them in the past. The eminent child psychiatrist Donald Winnicott defined maturity, the healthy expression of Saturn, as the capacity to handle paradox. This is really Saturn, Capricorn, as it applies to Libra on an emotional basis, Cancer, that you can weigh the two sides of the situation, Libra, that you can understand that every relationship problem has two sides to it based on the two people. Capricorn, in its healthy function, integrates this capacity to recognize that life is not just black or white. It's all these different shades. But the fearful, shadowy place inside people always lives as if life is black and white, and that the black side will be exposed somehow by some revelation, by some failure. Maybe it's a fear of public speaking. If I don't do this astrology talk right, I will somehow be shameful or bad. Maybe it's in the workplace when confronting an authority figure. If I say that to my boss, I'll be exposed as shameful and bad. People will see I'm no good at my job. Even the healthiest person tends to have some subtle areas prone to this kind of process. But in many people, it is absolutely dominant. It literally, Capricorn at the top of the chart, dominates their personal and psychological experience. Now, moving forward, we see, if we look here, the ego forms at the first Saturn square, or around that. This corresponds to Cancer, Aries to Cancer, the first part of this Saturn cycle. Then we see at age 14, the Saturn opposition, we develop social awareness through puberty, sexual feelings. We see Libra during the 14 years, the second segment of the Saturn cycle. We get to Libra. Then we go on to a place where the Saturn and the Uranus cycles intersect, age 21. Here, Saturn is in a last quarter square, and Uranus is in a first quarter square to its natal positions. This is the first intersection of the Saturn-Uranus cycle. This is the age when people are trying to leave college to work out if they're capable of leaving home and making their way in the world. In some ways, psychologically, it's a territory that many, many people never fully overcome, how to fit in to this world in some meaningful way that supports myself, but how, whilst I do that, to retain a sense of my authentic true self. How do I find legitimacy in the civilization and society in which I'm in without sacrificing my true self? Now, huge numbers of people never resolve this conflict. It is literally one of the most common forms of arrested development. This is part of the Pluto-Uranus crisis on a world level. This is part of it, as it were, the maturation cycle of humanity itself. This is an issue not just pertinent to this life phase when two cycles intersect. This is part of the symbolism of Uranus squaring Pluto in Capricorn. Now, what I'm trying to do here is, in a sense, set up the second part of today's talk. In a moment, we'll take a short break, and then we will get to the specific nature of the Uranus-Pluto square. But what I wanted to do was show some of the context of meaning from which you can explore this square, the basis, if you like, of how to understand it on a deep level. And in a sense, it's the culmination of the cardinal cross with Uranus in Aries and Pluto in Capricorn. And this whole issue of the tyranny of the should, as Karen Horney called it, this whole issue of what you should or ought to do, and if you don't, you are bad as an individual, as a tribe, as a collective, as a society. The Uranus and Aries energy is pushing against that. It is like an electrical light or bolt of energy coming from the nonlinear mind, pushing against every kind of should, every kind of structural imposition on self. Uranus intensifies the struggle with Saturn, and here it intensifies the struggle implicit in the Pluto-Capricorn archetype. It's probing the nature of every imposition of personal and collective freedom. Yes, this manifests through the potency of the Arab Spring and certain social and political conflicts in the world, but this is also a directly personal occurrence. This is happening to everyone on an individual level right now. This struggle, where this impulse emerging from the nonlinear mind is pushing against the limits of your potential or possibility. It's pushing against every should you ever encountered in your conscious life. It's pushing against every should you encountered in your unconscious life when you were a very small child, being conditioned by your family and upbringing. It's pushing against every should that you encountered in every single prior life. When you really understand the level on which these transpersonal planets are operating, you realize it is pushing against every should or restriction that you have ever experienced. To give us one sort of visionary example before we take a short break and move to the Uranus-Pluto square in its specific depth, here's a beautiful Uranian image. When the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, when it goes into its little Saturn structure in order to change, what scientists have discovered is that it essentially turns into liquid first, a sort of liquid of pure potential, and arising from that liquid are what they have termed imaginal cells. This is primarily because they don't know what they are, because they have no prior equivalent in the RNA and DNA of the caterpillar. There is nothing pre-existing in the caterpillar to allow for the butterfly, not in any currently observable form. There is nothing in its linear, particular existence that prepares one for the emergence of the butterfly. From the liquid it goes into, there arises completely new cells that were not there before, that become the structure of the transformation. a really rather radical and beautiful image. Now, we'll just take a short break. I don't know what kind of breaks we've been doing, Leroy. What's appropriate? A couple of
Well,
minutes?
why don't we say 3 minutes or so? Not to be too exact, but thank you, Mark. As always, it's engaging talk, and you're setting the stage for the second half, which has got us all on the edge of our seats.
Thanks, Leroy. So back in a couple of minutes, just a short restroom or water break for everyone.
In the meantime, for those of you that did not have to take a break or would like to participate in one of our polls, as many on this call know, Mark is a psychosynthesis therapist from Bristol, England. And what does that word mean, I wonder? So let's just launch this poll to kind of honor the work that Mark's doing in integrating evolutionary astrology with his counseling practice. Psychosynthesis has departed from the empirical foundations of psychology, i.e., Freud and Jung, in that it studied the person as one would be bones and blood, two, a collection of mythical associations. Did it depart from psychology in that it studied the person as a personality and a soul, or someone just controlled by sexual impulses, or as extensions of Freud and Jung? So about a third of us have voted so far. I'll leave this up for a while as Mark refreshes himself for part two of his talk.
Hi.
Hey, all right. You're back again. Um, Mark, we're just finishing a poll here, and
Yes.
after the poll, would you be willing to take a question from somebody who's raised their hand on the board?
Absolutely.
Okay. Marie Claire, just hold on for a moment, and we'll unmute you after we get most of the votes in here as people return back to their computers and devices. All right, well, let's close the poll and share some results with everybody on our poll question, Mark. We asked about psychosynthesis today, honoring your
Yes.
work. And it indeed did integrate the personality and the soul in a very powerful way. So, Marie Claire, I'm going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your lucid question of Mark Jones.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, very, very interesting. I really loved your work.
Thank you.
When you talk about superego, are we still
Yes.
talking about the moon or are we talking about Saturn?
Very good question. Very good. I believe we're talking about an interaction between the two. Um, superego is primarily Saturnine, but it is Saturn in relationship to the moon. So if we go back to this cardinal cross, you see in a sense this is true authority or judgment here, Capricorn. But in its misapplied way, it can limit self-expression, Aries, becoming the basis for distortion, anger, rage. It can judge relationships, at a really simple level. Your father doesn't like who you're dating, or the family doesn't approve of the union of the marriage. And this is all in the Capricorn Cancer dynamics, the dynamics of parent as authority figure and emotional child or parent as nurturing figure. And to me, your question is actually brings up the really rather subtle dance between Capricorn and Cancer, because I believe personally that superego evolves out of that polarity itself, not just Saturn. It's actually Saturn in relationship to the moon, and then seeing, if you like, the child or the sensitive, vulnerable part of the person, Cancer, as somehow inferior, and then setting up these tyrannical protective forces in the psyche to somehow keep this vulnerable, inferior part safe. And then in the name of that safety, becomes very narrow, very rejecting of life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I mean, I do think it's a great question. I believe certain archetypes evolve only in relationship to each other. They evolve in their dialogue, if you like. Yeah. Any other questions?
It looks at this point, Mark, like you are very good to go. Got some great comments from many people on the board how wonderful the talk is, and someone's even describing you as somewhat brilliant, Mark. So there you go. There's little.
Whoever they are a genius themselves. But I'm biased. No, thanks everyone. I mean, I am attempting to summarize, in a way, foundationally, my entire perspective on astrology, so that when we contemplate the Uranus-Pluto cycle, we are doing so from a vantage point. Now, you see, an astrologer I respect enormously, Richard Tarnas, which these quotations are from, and I'm not just going to read them out for you. You all have eyes, you're all bright people. He's commenting here on how this is one of the longest planetary cycles, i.e., the conjunction, the squares, they don't happen very often. The Uranus-Pluto square in the sky right now is the first one since the mid-late 60s, early 70s, when they were conjunct. Now, someone like Richard Tarnas, who is enormously bright, multidisciplinary person, an expert in Jungian psychology, archetypes, writes on the archetypal nature of astrology, here associating Uranus with emancipatory, progressive and innovative, rebellious, awakening, destabilizing energies, and Pluto with instinctual, powerfully compelling, libidinal, which just means, full of eros, full of life force, sexuality, and destructive, overwhelming and transformative. This is the best archetypal astrologer out there. Richard Tarnas is as bright as you get in that field. And I love his work. Nothing I'm about to say is a criticism of his work. It is simply an extension of it. In a sense, his work is extended by his own collaborator and mentor and the person whose papers he is editing, Stanislav Grof, who has developed this idea of what he calls systems of condensed experience. Now, we're going to go on to explore what they are, but notice here from his work in the Archive Journal, Volume 4, Death, Rebirth and Revolution, a journal that he put out with Richard Tarnas and some others. Natal and transit astrology has also provided a deeper understanding of another important concept, that of the coex system. Natal and transit astrology, the birth chart and configurations in the sky, such as the Pluto-Uranus square. What is a coex? It is a constellation, a basic theme, a way that mentally, emotionally, physically, psychosomatically, all gets tied together into one big jumble of thread of experience, is constellated in a person's life. And the one thing that seems to impose and fix these constellations is the trauma of birth. Notice my personal note here from Grof's quotation. Obviously, the point of birth is the origin of the birth chart. The origin of the birth chart, the point of birth, fixes these coexes, these systems of condensed experience. Basically, it's an extension of the Jungian idea of the complex, an interaction of mental, emotional, physical body, instinctual body, energy patterns all together into one deep area. From our point of view, the interesting thing is it's going to represent different layers of karmic memory from multiple lives. And Grof goes on to make this explicit. various forms of transpersonal phenomena, such as past life experiences, Jungian archetypes, and conscious identification with animals and other people. This level of non-linear experience is also tied in to the coex, to the system of condensed experience. So it's a vision of astrology from the work of archetypal astrology, as practiced by Tarnas, that expands even on the Jungian archetypes into past life experience. And this is, in a sense, the vision of where evolutionary can help us, evolutionary astrology can help us, especially when it's allied to a transpersonal psychology such as psychosynthesis. When you ground the evolutionary journey of the soul into an understanding that that is actually happening presently at all times from these nonlinear elements in your energy field, symbolized by the outer planets, in particular Pluto and Uranus, Neptune in a sense symbolizing our relationship to the entire field, the collective dimension. Uranus, the mind of the soul, Pluto, the heart of the soul. Here we have an understanding of how past life experience is contained as a symbolic correspondence to these coexes, to these dynamic constellations of experience, anchored in the birth chart. Uranus and Pluto speak of that. They speak of what's anchored in the birth chart. And of course, by transit, such as their square in the sky from last year until 2015 or whatever, happening right now. So, what's this mean? What does it mean that this non-linear dimension is constellated so intensely right now? Well, I would say to you that the personal struggle, and let's just separate it from political events of upheaval. Yes, the Arab Spring and the impulse of these people for democracy is a genuine one and deserves to be heard, as all great civilizations go through these cycles. As, the countries in Europe and North America went through progressive cycles of awakening to greater social responsibility and democracy. The Civil War had its roots in the slavery issue. An issue that was attempted to be dealt with in the Declaration of Independence, but failed. So all modern civilizations have gone through these periods of great conflict, including vast global conflicts in recent times. So it's not unusual. But to separate it from the political and social world and bring it back radically to the personal world. Everyone's struggling for personal freedom. Everyone is struggling to find the courage and integrity, the pioneering personal energy. Aries, Uranus in Aries, the liberating spark coming through pioneering impulse of freedom, the courage to attain it, to pioneer and go forward and take it, and which they are trying to overcome the blocks of imposed judgments and hierarchies from without, Capricorn, Saturn, or more powerfully even, the tyranny of internal judgments, internal prohibitions, the thou shalt not inside our own minds, inside our own psyche. We're seeking to find this maturation, Pluto in Capricorn, this way of being personally and collectively responsible. Now let's remember the dimension of this. Remember Stanislav Grof's experience where the lightning bolt carved onto the ancient rock these symbols, and he intuited it meant he had had these long line of past lives and he had to take responsibility for them as well as his current life, even though he didn't consciously remember what had occurred. So some of the conflicts from the Pluto-Uranus square triggered in the sky now stem back throughout history. They are conflicts within us that come from any and every time we tried to overcome negative use of authority and power in order to be our true selves. Either power from without, external authority, or power within, as we struggled with the negative introjects, the messages saying, no, you can't do this, it's shameful if you do that. We are all wrestling with all our karmic memories of those situations. When the person comes in from work, tired, pent up, Their boss has been demeaning. They feel belittled by the circumstances of their work. This seemingly ordinary day-to-day tragedy can have echoes in karmic experiences of slavery, scapegoating from tribe or family, even infanticide, poverty, survival concerns, memories of collective traumas. If I don't keep on doing this job with this person who treats me like crap, I will die, my family will die, we'll starve to death. Karmic memories. So this extra dimension opens up when we open up our understanding of karmic astrology. So we are seeing with the Pluto-Uranus square in Aries and Capricorn this multi-dimensional meaning in the search for personal freedom that is just as relevant in your day-to-day life as it is in Egypt or Syria. It is just as relevant in your relationship with your partner, your relationship to your current employer, your relationship to your own internal sense of what it is to live up to your life's expectations. This is just as relevant to the universe, that part of the universe that knows everything, the nonlinear field. Every hair on your head is counted, cares just as much about your seeming ordinary, personal, trivial struggles as the great political conflicts of the day. This is the meaning of understanding how the nonlinear world interfaces with the linear world. So we see that history is both personal and transpersonal. Many of these difficult, complex, and traumatic memories emerging socially and politically at this time, but also individually as we feel this pressure to live up to our true potential, to actually mature into our full, pioneering, courageous self. The struggle we have is contained in these deep series of lifetimes, memories, all the times we've fought people, all the times we've tried to have freedom, all the times we've used power over others or people have used power over us. You see how complex it becomes, how rapidly. Just on a personal level, just think of every possible karmic memory you might have of how people in power treated you, for example. It's phenomenally expansive when you look at it this way, and you realize that the meaning of the personal struggle just to deal with your job, your parent, your partner, just to live your life in an authentic and meaningful way is spiritual evolution, is the evolutionary journey of the soul. It is not some happening on some fantastical level out there in history, out there in someone else's life who's more fabulous and more interesting than you. Your intimate personal struggles, your personal desire and impulse to be authentic despite the reactions of others, despite the guilt trips of your parents or a particular social group. This is evolution in action, attempting to overcome this tyranny of the should, this you have to be a certain way, otherwise you are deeply wrong. Now, during this whole time period, from June 2012 all the way till March 2015, we have this exact series of squares occurring in different degrees of Aries and Capricorn. These are the intense trigger points where the square is at its closest. But the whole period is colored by this energy. From 2012 to 2015, the dominant field is this close series of squares between these planets. This issue of personal autonomy, personal authenticity, overcoming the tyrannical voices of the past is relevant to everyone, and it is especially relevant from the summer of 2012 till the spring-summer of 2015. It is heightened because of the transit astrology. And the view of radical empowerment I'm proposing is during this entire time frame, you have a karmic challenge, if you like, a window of opportunity in which to test out and respond to this possibility within yourself to become more courageous, more expressive of the pioneering, innovative consciousness within yourself. And yet, there may be this need to explore deeply, deeply, Pluto, these fears or inner or outer voices that seem to say what you should or ought to be. Arguably, the greatest block to personal evolution, the idea that you should or ought to be, because this is a failure to acknowledge what is. Real transformation is only possible from what is. Anything else is a lack of acceptance. Anything other than what already is a disconnect from reality, an attempt to have a fantasy that it ought to be better, or a spiraling negative victimized fantasy where it's terribly, terribly worse. The clarity of what is, i.e. the clarity of the truth, is what allows us progressively to mature, Capricorn, in order to liberate, Uranus and Aries, through courageous pioneering action in the service of our own lives. This is what this signature means. This is the challenge on a personal level. What is the courageous and right action in our personal lives? Now, the origin of this Pluto-Uranus square is the last conjunction. The synodic cycle of a planetary pair simply means, when they were conjunct, when they go on to square and oppose each other, and when they conjunct again. So, the origins of the current synodic cycle of Pluto and Uranus are in Virgo. The conjunction in Virgo in the 1960s. This particular momentum of personal transformation, the courage to pioneer and innovate, Uranus and Aries, and overcome on a deep level any voice inside or outside that says you cannot do that, Pluto in Capricorn, is created here in response to the conjunction in Virgo. Now, we could spend the entire time of today's talk just trying to contemplate what that means. What we can certainly say is that we're in a period now where we are trying to respond, the response being a crisis in action, according to Rudyard in his work on phases. The first quarter square being a crisis in action. How do I act with regard to the original conjunction? Here we are trying both consciously and unconsciously as a collective to explore the meaning of the mid-late 1960s and very early 1970s. That's how this crisis is manifesting, if you like. This attempt, this challenge between personal integrity and pioneering spirit and these voices of authority or judgment. What was the 1960s? What in the 1960s happened that is still relevant today, or what has been overlooked? I mean, a number of things occur for me. The use of psychedelic drugs has completely dropped from therapeutic practice, much to the distress of Stanislav Grof, who can barely conceal his disgust at someone like Timothy Leary for messing up the professional element of its use, even though Timothy Leary did allow many other people who wouldn't otherwise to have had that experience. The use of psychedelic drugs in healing work has been reduced to isolated programs such as the Johns Hopkins Medical Facility, where it's used with terminal cancer patients who are suffering from anxiety or depression about their illness. So that's the only way such a radical healing form is allowed within the current structures of hierarchy of the modern establishment. Not just if you have cancer, but you have terminal cancer and you're anxious and depressed about that person. Terminal cancer, and then in a few rare universities and university hospitals you can have guided LSD therapy, of which in this Johns Hopkins experiment, and this is recorded in an excellent documentary called Substance, which interviews Albert Hoffman very beautifully, 75% of people present with a primary mystical experience on their first guided session. 75%, a primary mystical experience on their first use. So the healing impact of such a revolutionary part of the 1960s has been completely sidelined by the authorities, as has other radical healing forms. I mean, I'm just picking one, really. Many radical healing forms, Virgo, healing, have been sidelined in the name of Mercury as perceived in a discriminating way. Remember the Virgo symbolism, taking the data, Gemini, and discriminating about that data, Virgo. Within the current cultural conditioning, Capricorn, Pluto in Capricorn, and the conditioning of our civilization towards, empirical observation, science, cognitive research, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. That's what they believe. Consciousness, our soul, if you like, is just an accidental spark of the electricity firing in the neurons in your brain. From this point of view, the issue of healing, Virgo, and the health of the body and psyche becomes narrowly reduced, and hence you get the medicalization of healing. Healing becomes the multi-billion-dollar antidepressant and psychiatric drug fiasco, really, in many ways, where people are routinely given substance for years and decades that they don't even fully understand how they're working. Now, you could argue in a sense then that some meaning of this Uranus square Pluto for astrologers, for people interested in radical healing modalities, is in uncovering these non-linear dimensions that the narrowness of the current cultural conditioning has, in a sense, stepped on, has attempted to extinguish. That we ourselves, as these, if you like, shantytown children intellectually, scruffing around on the trash heap of history, trying to find, in the gold standard of superstition, something of real value, actually are sat on a gold mine. That actually in a culture reeling from the over-intellectual, over-discriminative attitude of the Uranus-Pluto synodic cycles issue in Virgo, the crisis, that this is actually a link to a collective crisis of meaning, which we may have our own part to play in undoing. I would argue to you, and I find this time and time again in my sessions, and I liken this to an idea by a radical Sufi called Hakim Bey, the temporary autonomous zone. My healing work, sometimes the astrology reading, is a temporary autonomous zone. It is literally a little sacred vessel outside of the rules of the current civilization, outside of the modes and judgments of this civilizational society, in which we have the possibility to be authentic and communicate directly and observe the non-linear dimension of the soul and what might be occurring. As astrologers, we ourselves have the capacity to facilitate some of the transformations that this Pluto-Uranus square is offering. Now, I might have to be necessarily brief on this section just to kind of give a sense of possibility. Obviously, I have selected, this is an enormously selective choice. There were countless tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people born with these signatures who were not great artists or inspirational figures. But in the last Pluto-Uranus first quarter square, in the 1870s, in this case in 1877, Hermann Hesse was born, a writer who struggled with very difficult personal impulses, a very strong sense of struggle with himself, suicidal ideation, significant attempts at suicide when he was a young man. And he struggled with the tyranny of the should, Saturn with the moon. He, was pressures on him to join family business or to do work that he didn't really wanted. He'd always wanted to be a writer. He ran away from a religious reform school in order to become a writer, but he was too young when that happened, and that precipitated a suicide attempt. And then from his 20s, well into later life, he wrote a series of books which spoke of the enriching of the current of Western civilization with thoughts from the East, through books like Siddhartha, or the glass bead game. He explored ideas, revolutionary philosophical and spiritual concepts. In order, we see that his radical empowerment, it's like life-saving to him. Pluto in Taurus, North Node in the second. He wants, and Pluto essentially square the nodes with Uranus on the South Node. I mean, anyone interested in my actual approach of reading charts, which there will not be chance to describe today, I could refer to the book Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus, and the Lunar Nodes, which is a very clear exposition of my method for reading charts. But clearly we see here a traumatized being coming into this life who already had deep issues around power versus powerlessness and a sense of his own meaning, a struggle for his own meaning, but he made that struggle part of a collective voice for a higher meaning. He made that struggle something that bridged the increasingly narrowing stream post the Industrial Revolution of his current civilization. And if we look, remember that our Pluto in Capricorn square Uranus in Aries comes from their conjunction in Virgo. Well, for Hermann Hesse, the conjunction came in late Aries. And here we see revolutionary upheaval. And we have the Industrial Revolution in full swing. So we see society itself as really rapidly changing. Now Hesse sees this and recognizes the destruction of the central myth of that civilization. Christianity, centuries of the medieval imagination, linking the spheres of the planets to heavenly angels, this sense of participation that the medieval imagination had that is being shattered at this point in history. And Hesse tries to bring in influences from Buddhism, Vedantic Hindu philosophy, existentialism. My point here is inspiration. My point being is, even counter to the prevailing norms of your civilization, there is much to offer. Again, the figure Mozart. Again, Mozart's born under a Pluto-Uranus first quarter square. And I was describing him in a workshop recently on the astrology of creativity. And I was describing how there was this piece of music called the Allegri. Allegri's Miserere. It's called the Miserere by Allegri. And the Pope had liked it so much. It was a polyphonic, multi-voice piece. The Pope had enjoyed it so much that he had preserved it. He had said it will only be played in the Vatican by the castrati choir, and only on this certain festival week. So people all around the world would visit Rome on part of their grand tour, often coming at that festival week just to hear that piece of music. And this went on for like some 100+ years. And then suddenly, on a tour with his father, a teenage boy, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, on hearing the piece for the second time only, transcribes it from memory, all 12.5 minutes of it, every single part. And then suddenly it floods around Europe. Now, I was using this in the workshop as an example of Uranus conjunct the South Node in Pisces. The kind of way that his individual nonlinear mind, Uranus, remembered music, just heard it, could picture it, and then just bring it through, just hold it in that holographic library. But someone else pointed out in the workshop, very astutely I thought, just how incredibly rebellious and innovative and pioneering and yet rebellious this action was, as it was in a way flipping the bird to the Pope. It was like, your control cannot hold me. I am too progressive. My insight is too progressive to be contained. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. A teenage boy unravels this attempt of some earlier pope, a century plus before, to keep this piece of music hidden away from the world, like a butterfly in a cage, or, in a glass case. Keep it almost dead, apart from this occasional week, where it could live in one form. And suddenly it's doing the rounds of Europe, transcribed by this teenage prodigy. Radical innovation. Now, the synodic cycle in which Mozart was born in a first quarter Pluto-Uranus square was in Leo. And here you have the start of the Industrial Revolution, with the invention of the steam engine and the discovery that coal can be used to create sufficient temperature to smelt iron. And this is just literally the creative origin of the Industrial Revolution. Now, another figure born in that exact same period is William Blake, again with this first quarter square from Pluto to Uranus. So remember, in Mozart's case, it's Pluto in Sagittarius in the fourth, square Uranus in Pisces on the south node in the seventh. In Blake's case, it's Pluto in Sagittarius in the fifth, square Uranus in Pisces in the ninth. And here you have this, essentially, most of his life poor, just like Mozart. There was no great sense that civilization turned around and said, you're one of the great poets or you're one of the great musicians, Mozart. They did for brief periods. These men made a sort of living in their lives, but they're now universally understood as some of the great pioneers and innovators in music, and in Blake's case, in the world of art and poetry, which he self-engraved after an 8-year apprentice as a young man, learned the skills, and then built a completely unique vision over decades as an answer to the prevailing problems of the Industrial Revolution that he saw unfolding around him. He was a counternote. He offered a counternote where he critiqued what he called Newton's sleep, the way that civilization and technology had made us drowsy, and we did not realize we were destroying the beauty of nature for the sake of these towering edifices of modernity. He moved as a counter trend, something that is increasingly relevant, by the way, with this Uranus-Pluto synodic cycle starting in Virgo, this essentially crisis that's emerging into consciousness within modern society, a crisis based on the symbolism of this cycle. Why crisis? Well, because Virgo is a transitional archetype following Leo. We spoke about how the instinctual body of Aries, the feeling inner value Taurus, the mental functioning of Gemini coalesce at Cancer and the Moon to form the ego or conditioned self. Leo is then the archetype of the creative expression of that conditioned self, singing the song of that self. I sing of myself, like Whitman in Leaves of Grass, the song of myself. Virgo is a transition from that. It is the turning of the creative self within to contemplate and assess any destructive aspects of the egocentricity of self. And it is often precipitates a crisis, because it's very hard for us. When we try to remove, as it were, the sun as the center of our being, we're often left with a hole inside, and Virgo can fall into this crisis, this hole inside. The crisis of the current time is this healing crisis, which includes both a personal dimension and a vast global ecological and environmental dimension. As we realize the cost of these vast wars, as we discover the cost of the modern capitalist juggernaut, the thousands of miles food travels for production, the huge cost of pesticides used on the soils running through the rivers, destroying parts of the Pacific Ocean, huge areas of the Pacific covered in just reams of plastic, the damage of our own excess. And these are not issues that will go away. They transcend politics. It is an actual crisis of the human self. It is a crisis of maturation. How to live in a world, how to live in a place without destroying that place, as countless cultures have in the past, from Easter Island to aspects of the Anasazi people to, vast empires fallen into disrepair, Egypt, and many, many others. Here we have a healing crisis as the operational motif of this entire synodic cycle, which, remember, goes on for, many, well over a century, one of the longest cycles, as Richard Tarnas pointed out. Now we can see, by the way, just structurally, whenever you see an inconjunct or a quincunx anywhere in the chart, whether it's part of a yod formation or not, you're looking at a potential crisis operating on some kind of level as it pertains to a Virgo aspect. In this case, the nature of Virgo itself is highlighted because of the origins of this Pluto-Uranus square in the conjunction that occurred in the mid-60s in Virgo. Now, let's just hold that thought for a second. I'll make a few more suggestions, and I'll open up to a couple of questions, and we'll see if we have time for a personal example. There are many things that occurred in the 60s, not just the points I identified. And there was the rise of the environmental movement. There was the return to a certain form of feminist thinking, or a new pioneering intellectual discovery of the impact of patriarchy on both men and women. There were various social changes occurring in the aftermath of the Second World War that suddenly stabilized in the 60s, and from that, certain travel potentials or ways of seeing the world expanded. It would pay all of us, I suspect, during the period of this Pluto-Uranus square, to ask ourselves, what from that period, what from the kind of revolutionary ideals of the 60s, from the student riots to the hippie movement to certain, intellectual and philosophical movements, the environmental movement, women's studies, what is relevant to us today? What healing modalities? I think of radical anti-establishment figures like R.D. Laing, who actually tried to personally relate to the schizophrenics in his care, or Thomas Saz, who critiqued the idea that a controlling state can decide whether you're mad or not, which is a very kind of exposing a kind of overuse of the Capricorn archetype to judge the being of another. What in these voices, or the work of, this is the origin of the transpersonal psychology of Stanislav Grof, and the whole post-Jungian movement, and really the later thinking of Roberto Assagioli and psychosynthesis, the first truly spiritual psychology in the world. What from this period do we need to re-examine now in our individual and our collective lives? What issues pertaining to health, well-being, crisis of meaning, analysis of the excesses of egocentricity, or the turning on the head of the Leo archetype, what of those issues needs to be explored now in our current life? So I'll just leave the space open for a second to see if there's any questions.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
I do have someone
Yes.
from the audience wanting to know if you could address the Saturn Uranus inconjunct on October 6th. Are you familiar with this? I'll tell you what, Robin, I'm going to unmute you so you can speak directly to Mark, okay? So hold on
Can I
just
reserve the right, if it does involve me coming out of the PowerPoint and just putting solar fire or something on to see it?
Sure.
Let's see if I can answer it from a description, but otherwise I'll leave it till the
Sure.
very end when
Sure.
I've come out of the PowerPoint. Okay.
Yeah, I'll
put them on.
Yeah. Robin, oh, hold on a second. I'm on Leroy's computer, so I'm learning. Robin, you're unmuted.
Hello. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Really enjoying today. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely wonderful and making my hair stand up. It's been great.
I'm glad.
Yes. Just wondering, please, if you could just speak, because you sort of spoke to it a little bit. I'm noticing, just as I'm looking at a tri-wheel here, just happened to look at one dated October 6th.
Yes.
That Saturn will actually be in an inconjunct to Uranus.
Yes.
And
a mutual reception to Pluto too, won't it? To the Pluto in Capricorn. This is Saturn in Scorpio in conjunct Uranus in Aries.
Of course.
The Saturn in Scorpio is in a mutual reception to the Pluto, and is in a way a reinforcement of the theme I'm talking about. So two things I would note about that, Robin. One, as it comes to these specific traumatic memories that may surface when we try to embody our truly progressive and independent self, Uranus in Aries, with Saturn in Scorpio, traumatic memories may include like a somatic sense of betrayal. I mean, when Uranus is in harsh aspect to other planets, and this is a teaching I've gone through in Healing the Soul and in numerous papers and recordings on my website, it forms trauma signatures, memories, unconscious memories individually and collectively of struggle. And here, The unconscious memories would include the way that authority has been used to sort of physically damage the self. So there's a kind of conflict about an inner sense of betrayal that could arise individually, collectively. But the real empowering thing, personally, Saturn in Scorpio, is commitment. The depth of the Scorpio archetype is commitment. If you commit to deep self, if you commit to soul, then in a sense, many of Scorpio's great and well publicized issues start to be surrendered. So the attraction repulsion dynamic starts to disappear. The fear of betrayal starts to disappear as you realize that committing to your own soul means you can never be betrayed, because even if other people treat you like awfully, you're still committed to the truth at the center within. So Saturn in Scorpio is about finding that structural, that maturation Saturn through deep commitment to self, which then allows the crisis we're talking about in the inconjunct to become the humbling of your pioneering and expressive spirit, Uranus in Aries, to take place under the guidance, the structural authority, Saturn, of the deep self, Scorpio. And this relates then to hidden meanings within the Pluto in Capricorn archetype because of its mutual reception, in which we find our true depth and power through karmic, existential, and psychological responsibility, Capricorn. The maturity of taking responsibility both for ourselves emotionally and psychologically now, but also ourselves as they've existed through past lives. So we realize when these fears of betrayal, of betraying ourselves, of failing or being judged arise, Saturn in conjunct Uranus, we're often dealing with subtle echoes of karmic memory as it's existed through multiple lives, and we can process this inner sense of betrayal by understanding that it will reflect all the times we felt betrayed by others, and also all the times we felt we betrayed ourselves in this and in other lives. So you realize that all of these aspects can be understood from this nonlinear point of view.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to use it wisely. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Good luck, Robin.
Thank you.
Anyone else with any questions they'd like to ask Mark? You can just raise your hand by hitting the block next to your name that raises the hand symbol, and I'd be happy to unmute you. As I'm looking, Mark, thank you very, very much for this. Again, anybody have any further questions for Mark? I'm not seeing any hands raised, Mark, so
okay.
You're doing a great job. If you have more information you want to share.
So let's look at an example, just briefly in our time together. Let's look at an example of an individual born during the almost exact convergence of the prior synodic cycle. If we look at this chart, 15th of March 1968, 1:20 a.m., Cheltenham, UK, we see that Pluto and Uranus are conjunct on the midheaven in Virgo. Now, I'm going to inevitably, for the purposes of our conversation, simplify this analysis enormously and for the time constraints we have. But it's just interesting to relate what we've been talking about to the life of an individual who's kindly given me her permission to use her as an example. So this lady grew up abroad, grew up in Europe, as her father was like an officer in the army. And after enjoying an initially very close relationship with him, around the age 6, when you start going to early school, infant school, notice this is also the age that Freud outlined as the coherent start of memory, and the age we could say is the first Saturn square, and also the age here in which solar arced Pluto hit Uranus. So we can see that she's especially sensitive to something deep erupting from her nonlinear field of consciousness at a very young age. Now, when she first went to school, her father just seemed to cut off from her. Just overnight withdrew. And it was never the same again. And this has haunted her in her life. We can see South Node Libra. She's been very dependent on what others think of her in the past. Venus in Aquarius with Mercury in Aquarius, a trauma about things people say to her or don't say to her. Her father cutting off from this loving, encouraging presence to this distant, judgmental, sergeant major, both at work and at home, distressed this person. And what did she do? Pluto, Uranus, Moon, Virgo. And so we can see that the solar arc, Pluto, by the way, didn't just hit Uranus, it hit the Moon. The eruption of the deep self into early childhood is symbolized literally by the progressions. What did she do? She internalized herself as lacking. My father doesn't love me because I am not pretty enough. I am not intelligent enough. I'm not doing well enough at school. The child searches. They cannot believe the parent would betray them. So they look within for what is wrong. Now, during this Pluto-Uranus square, here Pluto at 11 Capricorn and Uranus coming up, 8 on the way to 9 Aries. This is literally the day it happened. The sun is part of the aspect too. And it's taking place on her natal Saturn, which the Uranus is transiting throughout the period of processing this eventful day. She is out many, many moons later. So she has her own child. She's a single parent now. She still feels bad. She's been prone. Look at the South Node in Libra, Venus in Aquarius with Mercury, to Venus ruling the 7th house, to traumatic relationships with men. One in particular recently is verbally cruel and lets her down constantly. And we've had a chance to explore why has this happened, and this tyrannical father image that has haunted her life and predisposed her to find men problematic. She is used to men that criticize her. She is used to men that ignore her. And it is her emotional conditioning then, Moon in Virgo in the 10th with Uranus, to allow that kind of man to form her primary emotional attachments in the present. Anyway, she is out in a restaurant with the father and the father's new girlfriend. The father left the mother a long time back. And the new girlfriend says, "Oh, you look well." And she says, "Thanks, but I could just start crying all day again tomorrow if life just takes me the wrong way." "Oh, goodness," says the father's new girlfriend. "Why is that, you think?" And his family, age 16 years old, and this time the stepfather steps in, walks him down the road, and they enroll. The father of my client, enrolls in the army at 16, force marched there by his stepfather, who he is trying to rat out as an abuser. The abuse of his sister began originally when the father's biological father, my client's grandfather, when the sister went to school, when she started infant school, the exact age in which this man cut off from his daughter, when the father cut off from my client when she went to infant school. Terrified by the thought, I am the son of an abuser. And more than that even when this new figure came into his life, he was an abuser as well. So, haunted by this past trauma, the father withdrew from his daughter out of fear that he would get it wrong, that he would enact abusive patterns of behavior, that he would want to molest her. Shattered by these early experiences in his own life that he'd never had the capacity to share with anyone. And only this new relationship with his new girlfriend had allowed that to come out. When he shared this with my client, the context arose, the liberating understanding arose. It's not her. It's not just something fundamentally wrong with her. It is a systemic trauma. Uranus moon in the 10th. It is a whole background within the family. And here the possibility arises, which is being processed now as Uranus has moved further on. Uranus to Saturn, Uranus to North Node. The realization that it was not a defect in her, that it was not a should or an ought to in her that she failed to live up to, that she's internalized as shame for the great majority of her life. The revelation of the information offers the potential for radical empowerment. Now, this is my point today. True radical empowerment lies within. This is the internal revolution. You try to throw off the bondage of the centuries. Whether you approach that from a karmic point of view in prior lives, or through the collective unconscious, the weight of all the collective experience of humanity embodied as history that weighs upon you, you have to understand, in a sense, that the courage and integrity to face your challenges in your own personal life is as relevant spiritually as the actions of the great masters. You are like Gandhi in your own life. You get to rebel against your own tyrannical government within. And it's just as important to the universe, the outcome of that conflict, as was Gandhi's, in a way. You are that important. And your radical empowerment under this Pluto-Uranus square is to see this as a karmic opportunity to liberate yourself from the shackles of the past. And I wish you all the very best, all of you, with that process. Here on my website, plutoschool.com, you can find resources for students, and I can be contacted personally, Mark Jones at plutoschool.com. Mark with a K, Jones at plutoschool.com. All the best, everyone.
Thank you, Mark.
I can take any questions for a couple of minutes, or if there are none, I'll just wish you the best with that.
Let's expand the question pane here and see if anybody is. Final call for questions. Anybody out there? Simply raise your hand, or you can. All just thank yous coming through, Mark. So you're good to go, and we appreciate everything with the talk today. It was very inspiring, deep, and everything we've come to expect from your presentations over the years. So appreciatively.